Between 1647 and 1685, in the church records of Connecticut colony, over 300 wills were executed in the small settlement of Newfield. All were processed through the same three men who shared the surname Pemberton. What historians found disturbing wasn't merely their number, but what was discovered beneath the floorboards of the Pemberton family home. Beneath those floorboards were hundreds of small glass vials as containing residue of opium and belladonna, alongside journals that detailed the divine visions of dying colonists. These were visions that mysteriously benefited the Pemberton family's growing fortune. 20. 3 people died within days of signing these wills, all while experiencing what witnesses described as rapturous communion with the divine. Fearing the scandal would undermine public faith in colonial institutions, the authorities, who discovered these records, reportedly sealed them away. Before we continue with the story of the Pemberton family, if you're brave enough to hear these dark historical truths, make sure to subscribe to our channel. This type of content isn't for everyone, only for those who truly seek to understand the shadows lurking in America's past. I'm curious how far these forgotten stories are reaching, so leave a comment telling us which state you're listening from. Now, let's return to colonial Connecticut, where our story begins. The case remained buried in historical archives until 1998, when a Yale researcher stumbled upon these documents and began piecing together what may have been early America's most sinister case of systematic inheritance fraud. Something particularly chilling was noted by the researcher. The Pembertons kept meticulous records of their victims' last moments, including transcriptions of their drug-induced utterances, which revealed a pattern of careful manipulation through religious suggestion. What follows is the true account of the Pemberton family and their decades-long scheme of manipulation, deception, and ultimately murder. In their quest for wealth and power, did the Pembertons simply exploit religious fervor and medical ignorance, or was there something more sinister at work in colonial Connecticut? The truth, as you're about to discover, is far more disturbing than most historical accounts have dared to reveal. Before we continue with the story of the Pemberton family, if you're enjoying these dark historical narratives, make sure to subscribe to our channel and join our community of historical mystery enthusiasts. I'm curious how far these forgotten stories are reaching, so leave a comment telling us which state you're listening from. Now, let's return to colonial Connecticut, where our story begins. The year was 1647, and the settlement of Newfield was still finding its identity among the growing townships of Connecticut colony. Like many New England communities, it was founded by those seeking religious liberty, strict Puritans, who had broken from the more established settlements, believing them already too lax in their devotion. Nestled between dense forests and rocky hillsides, the small township consisted of fewer than 60 families. Most lived in simple, wooden homes, arranged around a central meeting house that served as both church and governmental center. Winter in colonial Connecticut was always brutal, and the winter of 1647 had been particularly merciless. Food stores ran low, and illness spread quickly through the closely quartered settlement. It was during this desperate time that 3 brothers arrived in Newfield, having journeyed from Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Pemberton brothers, Obadiah, Jeremiah, and Cornelius, came bearing letters of introduction and recommendation that immediately established them as men of significant standing. Later investigation would reveal these letters to be expertly forged, with signatures of prominent Boston ministers and officials whose handwriting would have been unfamiliar to the isolated Newfield community. For months, the Pembertons had spent their time preparing these documents, studying the writing styles and sealed designs of various colonial authorities. This level of premeditation suggested their arrival in Newfield was not a matter of chance, but of careful selection. They had identified the community as an ideal target, isolated, struggling with illness and hardship, and desperate for educated leadership. Presenting himself as a physician trained in the latest medical practices of London was Obadiah Pemberton, the eldest at 34. With his solemn demeanor, carefully trimmed beard, and the black leather case of medical instruments he carried, he quickly became indispensable to the suffering community. In those early days of colonial medicine, a physician with formal training was exceedingly rare, and the settlers of Newfield considered his arrival nothing short of providential. The middle brother at 32, Jeremiah Pemberton, was a minister who had studied at Cambridge before journeying to the New World. Tall and gaunt, with penetrating eyes that seemed to look through rather than at a person, Reverend Pemberton spoke with quiet authority on matters of scripture and salvation. His sermons, delivered in a mesmerizing cadence that could last for hours without losing intensity, drew praise from even the most devoted Puritans of Newfield. Aged 29, the youngest brother, Cornelius Pemberton, presented himself as a man of legal training, versed in the intricacies of colonial law and record-keeping. Unlike his more austere brothers, Cornelius cultivated an air of worldly sophistication. His clothing, while still adhering to Puritan modesty, was of finer quality, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to authority. Within months of their arrival, the town council appointed him as magistrate, responsible for witnessing and recording legal matters for the settlement. The three brothers took residence in a house left vacant when the Wilton family succumbed to fever the previous winter. Standing slightly apart from the other dwellings, the two-story wooden structure was one of the larger homes in the settlement, with a stone foundation and multiple rooms, a rarity in a time when most families lived in single-room dwellings. The brothers quickly set about expanding it, adding a separate study for Cornelius's legal work, a small apothecary room for Obadiah's medicines, and a private prayer chamber for Jeremiah's spiritual contemplations. What made the Pembertons unusual for their time was that none had brought wives or children with them. When questioned, they would explain with practiced solemnity that they had dedicated their lives to service, rather than family. "Our calling is to tend to God's flock," Jeremiah would say, "not to raise our own." This abnormal arrangement raised few suspicions in a community where piety and dedication to community service were the highest virtues. Quickly, the brothers established themselves as pillars of the community. With tireless dedication, Obadiah tended to the sick, often spending days at the bedsides of those suffering from the various illnesses that plagued colonial settlements. Jeremiah provided spiritual comfort. His prayers and scriptural readings brought peace to the afflicted and their families. Cornelius ensured that all legal matters, from property disputes to contracts, were handled with meticulous attention to detail. It was goodwife Sarah Holcomb who first benefited from what would later become known as the Pembertons. Spiritual preparation for death. As the widow of one of Newfield's founding families, Sarah had inherited a considerable property on the eastern edge of the settlement, 60 acres of cleared land with a sturdy house, a barn, and various livestock. When she fell ill with what Obadiah diagnosed as consumption of the lungs, the three brothers took a special interest in her care. For weeks they visited her daily, Obadiah administering various tinctures and powders to ease her earthly suffering, Jeremiah reading scripture and leading her in prayer, and Cornelius ensuring her worldly affairs were in order. To the other settlers, nothing suspicious was seen in this attention. After all, Sarah was a wealthy widow without close family, and it seemed only proper that the community's leaders should ensure her comfort in her final days. What the community didn't witness were the private sessions that occurred after others had left. According to the journal later discovered in the Pemberton home, Sarah Holcomb was the first recipient of what Obadiah called the elixir of divine sight, a brownish liquid administered in carefully increasing doses that sent her into states of delirium that the brothers described to others as spiritual rapture. Disturbing details about their methodology are contained in the journal. The widow requires 15 drops initially, her constitution being weakened by grief and age. Obadiah wrote, Jeremiah shall introduce the concept of divine guidance regarding her property. On the second day, after the medicine has taken root in her mind, Cornelius shall have documents prepared in advance with sufficient blank spaces to accommodate whatever specifics may emerge from her visions. Another entry 3 days later reads, The widow responds most favorably to mentions of her deceased husband. When the elixir takes effect, Jeremiah need only suggest that her husband awaits her in heaven and wishes to communicate his desires regarding the earthly goods they once shared. She becomes most pliable when shown the family Bible during these episodes. Carefully orchestrated by the three brothers, during these episodes Sarah would speak in disjointed phrases about visions of heaven and divine instruction. Cornelius, always present with quill and paper, would record these utterances, later presenting them as Sarah's divinely inspired final wishes. Among these wishes was the bequest of her entire property to the Pemberton brothers, who would use it for the glory of God and the benefit of his servants in Newfield, who on December 14, 1647, when Sarah Holcomb died, her funeral was attended by the entire settlement. Jeremiah delivered a moving eulogy, speaking eloquently of Sarah's generosity and spiritual wisdom. Cornelius read aloud the will he had prepared, explaining to the assembled mourners that Sarah had been blessed with divine visions in her final days, during which she had received clear instruction on the disposition of her earthly goods. In a community where divine revelation was not only believed possible, but expected among the truly faithful, no one questioned the unusual circumstances of Sarah's will. Instead, many saw it as confirmation of the Pembertons' special relationship with God. For who else would a dying woman entrust with a divine mission? With the acquisition of the Holcomb property, the Pembertons began to establish what they carefully presented as a ministry of preparation, a special service for those facing death. As news of Sarah's peaceful passing and spiritual visions spread, other families began to request the brothers' presence when loved ones fell ill. Each time, the pattern would repeat. Obadiah would diagnose the ailment and administer his medicines. Jeremiah would provide spiritual counsel, and Cornelius would ensure legal matters were addressed. And each time as death approached, the brothers would administer their secret elixir, record the resulting divine visions, and emerge with documentation of the dying person's wish to contribute to the Pembertons' increasingly prosperous ministry. By the spring of 1650, the Pembertons had acquired 4 additional properties and established themselves as the wealthiest family in Newfield. They hired laborers to work the lands they had acquired, built a larger home for themselves near the meeting house, and began to exert increasing influence over the governance of the settlement. Their growing wealth raised few eyebrows. After all, they lived modestly despite their means, continued their dedicated service to the community, and spoke often of their plans to build a proper church and school with their resources. A reputation for piety and generosity was carefully cultivated by the Pembertons. They donated a portion of their harvests to families in need, established a small charity to provide medicines to the poor and funded improvements to the meeting house. These public acts of benevolence served as effective camouflage for their true activities, creating a shield of community goodwill that made questioning their methods unthinkable. Particularly clever was how they managed suspicions. When Goodman William Fletcher, one of the settlement's elders, privately questioned Jeremiah about the unusual number of property transfers benefiting the brothers, Jeremiah responded not with defensive anger, but with sorrowful concern. According to witness accounts later collected, Jeremiah suggested that such doubts might indicate a weakness of faith and offered to pray with Fletcher for strength against the devil's attempts to sow discord. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Fletcher left the conversation feeling ashamed of his suspicions rather than justified in them. The brothers also instituted what became known as Testimony Sundays, special worship services where they would invite those who had witnessed the divine visions of the recently deceased to share their experiences with the congregation. These public retellings served multiple purposes: reinforcing the legitimacy of the Pembertons' claims, creating peer pressure against questioning such sacred experiences, and implicitly warning others that any expression of doubt would be seen as an attack on the spiritual testimony of respected community members. Their careful building of both financial and social capital created a nearly impenetrable position within the community. By 1655, Jeremiah had been officially appointed as the settlement's minister. Cornelius served as both magistrate and record keeper for all official transactions, and Obadiah's medical authority went unquestioned. Effectively, they had gained control of Newfield's spiritual, legal, and physical well-being, a position that allowed them to continue their scheme with minimal risk of exposure. The pattern might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the arrival of Constance Pemberton in the summer of 1664, 17 years after the brothers had established themselves in Newfield. A carriage arrived bearing a young woman of about 16 who introduced herself as Obadiah's niece. With her came a letter explaining that she was the daughter of a fourth Pemberton brother who had remained in England and recently died, leaving Constance in the care of her uncles in the colonies. Tall and slender with the same penetrating eyes as Jeremiah, but a warmth the brothers lacked. Constance quickly became a beloved figure in Newfield. Unlike her stern, reserved uncles, she was quick to smile and eager to assist neighbors with chores or childcare. She attended prayer meetings dutifully, but showed none of the zealous intensity that characterized her uncle Jeremiah's faith. Instead, she exhibited a quiet, personal devotion that many found refreshing. A turning point in the Pemberton narrative was marked by Constance's arrival. For the first time, an outsider was living within the private world of the three brothers, observing their habits and conversations in unguarded moments. Although they maintained their public personas in her presence, the close quarters of colonial living made complete secrecy impossible. Initially, the brothers viewed Constance's arrival with mixed reactions, as documented in their private correspondence found years later. Obadiah saw her as a potential liability, writing to his brothers, "The girl observes too much and asks questions that reveal a dangerous cleverness." Jeremiah, ever conscious of appearances, noted that having a young female relative in our household will deflect certain questions about our lack of wives and add to our appearance of familial respectability. Cornelius, the most pragmatic, recognized both the risk and opportunity. Why must either secure her loyalty absolutely or ensure she has no opportunity to damage our position? Her inheritance from her grandmother presents a substantial opportunity if properly managed. For her part, Constance appears to have been genuinely grief stricken by her father's death and initially grateful for her uncle's acceptance. Her early letters to a childhood friend in England, discovered in the 1990s in a private collection, describe her uncles as stern but not unkind, and the community of Newfield as pious to the point of severity, but welcoming in their fashion. According to accounts later pieced together, Constance's first suspicions arose approximately 3 months after her arrival, when she discovered a hidden compartment in Obadiah's medicine chest while cleaning his study. Inside were vials containing substances different from those he used in his regular practice, labeled in a code she didn't understand. When questioned, Obadiah sharply reprimanded her for snooping and warned her never to touch his special medicines, explaining they were dangerous compounds for research purposes only. The incident might have been forgotten had Constance not witnessed what occurred at the Thatcher farm the following month. Thomas Thatcher, one of the settlement's more prosperous farmers, had fallen ill with a fever that Obadiah declared was likely fatal. As was now customary, the 3 brothers attended to him in his final days. Constance, who had accompanied them to help care for the Thatcher children, observed through a partially open door as Obadiah administered a dark liquid that was not among his regular medicines. Within an hour, Thomas Thatcher began to speak in disjointed sentences about angels and divine messengers, his eyes wide but unfocused. Cornelius, sitting beside the bed with paper and quill, recorded every utterance, occasionally asking leading questions. "And does the Lord show you who should tend to your northern fields, Thomas? Or has he revealed who should receive the mill you built last spring?" Disturbed by what she had witnessed, but uncertain of its significance, Constance began to pay closer attention to her uncle's activities. She noticed patterns, how they selected which dying individuals received their special attentions, focusing primarily on those with significant property and few direct heirs, how Obadiah would carefully adjust the dosage of his spiritual elixir based on the subject's size and constitution, how Jeremiah would interpret the resulting delirious ramblings through a spiritual lens, and how Cornelius would transform these interpretations into legally binding documents. Despite her growing suspicions, Constance remained silent. As an orphaned young woman in colonial New England, her position was precarious. Her uncles provided her with shelter, food, and a respected place in the community. To speak against them, especially without concrete evidence, would not only jeopardize her security, but might well be dismissed as feminine hysteria, or, worse, as evidence of a troubled spirit in need of correction. Instead, she began her own careful investigation, noting dates and names in a small journal she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. She volunteered to help Cornelius organize his papers, allowing her access to the growing collection of wills and property transfers that had benefited her uncles over the years. She assisted Obadiah in his apothecary, learning to recognize the preparations he made only for certain patients, and she listened attentively during Jeremiah's private conversations, gathering fragments of information about their methods and intentions. The turning point came in the winter of 1665, 18 months after her arrival in Newfield. A heavy snowstorm had confined the household for several days, and the brothers had departed for an urgent call to a dying elder despite the weather, leaving Constance alone in the house. Seizing the opportunity, she conducted a thorough search of the home, focusing on areas the brothers kept secured. In the cellar behind a false wall concealed by stacked firewood, Constance discovered a hidden room containing the evidence of her uncle's activities. Shelves lined with vials and jars of various substances occupied one wall. Another held stacks of journals dating back to their arrival in Newfield, detailing in clinical precision the treatments administered to dozens of dying colonists and the resulting visions that had enriched the Pemberton brothers. A laboratory far more sophisticated than anything that should have existed in colonial New England was revealed by the hidden chamber. Glass distillation equipment, botanical specimens preserved in alcohol, and carefully labeled containers of raw materials showed that Obadiah's medical knowledge went far beyond the rudimentary practices of frontier physicians. Among the equipment were several items that later historians would identify as having been stolen from university collections in England, suggesting that the Pembertons' criminal activities predated their arrival in the colonies. Most disturbing to Constance must have been the cabinet containing personal effects of previous victims, locks of hair, pieces of clothing, personal jewelry, and other small items, each labeled with a name and date. These weren't merely trophies. According to Obadiah's notes, they were materials used to create personalized treatments that would resonate with each victim's bodily humors. The level of calculated predation evidenced by this collection suggests a psychological detachment that goes beyond simple greed. But most disturbing was a ledger in Cornelius's meticulous handwriting, listing properties acquired, their values, and calculations of total wealth accumulated through their scheme. The final page included an entry that chilled Constance to her core. C.P. Inheritance from maternal grandmother, to be secured upon her 18th year. The initials matched her own, and with a shock of realization, Constance understood that she herself was intended to be their next victim. The heavy snow and her uncle's absence gave Constance precious time to consider her options. She copied key evidence into her journal, replaced everything as she had found it, and formulated a plan for escape. According to her journal, she intended to flee to Hartford as soon as weather permitted, taking her evidence to the colonial authorities there. But the winter of 1665 to 1666 was one of the harshest on record in New England. Snow continued to fall for weeks, making travel impossible. By the time paths were passable again, Constance had observed several more deathbed ministrations and gathered additional evidence of her uncle's methods. She had also noticed a subtle change in their behavior toward her. More questions about her health, discussions of her future, and comments about her maternal grandmother's estate that awaited her upon reaching adulthood. Most alarming was finding Obadiah examining her personal belongings one evening, including the hairbrush and drinking cup she used daily. When questioned, he explained he was concerned she might be showing early signs of the melancholy that had afflicted her father, and wished to prepare preventative treatments. The explanation, delivered with practiced concern, only deepened her determination to escape. According to entries in her journal, Constance planned her departure for April 15, 1666, when a merchant convoy would be passing through Newfield on its way to Hartford. She had carefully gathered her evidence, secured a small amount of money by selling embroidery work, and prepared a bundle of essential belongings. The night before her planned escape, she recorded a final entry. "I fear they suspect. Uncle O prepared a special tea this evening, insisting it would help me sleep. I pretended to drink, but disposed of it when unobserved. If I do not reach Hartford, let whoever finds this journal know that the Pemberton brothers have enriched themselves through wickedness, and that I fear I am their next intended victim." What happened the next day has been pieced together from various accounts. Constance was seen early in the morning near the village center, presumably waiting for the merchant convoy. Jeremiah Pemberton found her there and, according to witnesses, engaged her in earnest conversation before leading her back toward their home. By midday, Obadiah was summoning neighbors to help search for his niece, who he claimed had wandered off in a state of confusion brought on by a fever. Several witnesses later recalled that Constance had appeared perfectly lucid during her brief appearance in the village square. Martha Gower, the blacksmith's wife, reported that Constance had asked her about the expected arrival time of the merchants and had seemed clear of eye and steady of voice. This contradicted Obadiah's claim that she had been feverish and confused that morning. John Pratt, a village elder who encountered Constance with Jeremiah, later stated that while she had seemed troubled in spirit, there was no indication of physical illness. He remembered with particular clarity that when he asked if she was well, Jeremiah had quickly answered for her, stating that the girl suffers from womanly humors that affect her reason. The brothers organized the search parties with strategic effectiveness, directing different groups to search areas far from their property, while Cornelius remained at home to receive news of any sighting. This division ensured that for several critical hours, no one approached the Pemberton home, except the brothers themselves. What occurred during this time remains subject to speculation, but entries in Obadiah's medical journal, later recovered, suggest that Constance had been forcibly administered the same elixir used on their other victims, though in a much higher dosage intended to be fatal, rather than merely disorienting. The search continued for 3 days before Constance's body was discovered in the woods nearly a mile from the Pemberton home. Obadiah pronounced that she had succumbed to the same melancholy that had taken her father, wandering into the wilderness in her delirium. Despite his attempts to treat her condition, Jeremiah led the community in a solemn funeral, speaking movingly of the tragedy of a young life cut short and the mysterious ways of divine providence. The matter might have ended there, another tragic death in a time when early mortality was common, had it not been for goodwife Rebecca Wilson, who had been assisting in the Pemberton household with domestic duties. While cleaning Constance's room after the funeral, Rebecca discovered the loose floorboard and the journal hidden beneath it. Unable to read herself, she brought it to her husband, one of the few men in the settlement with some education. Thomas Wilson read enough to be deeply disturbed and, despite the risk to himself, decided to act. Rather than confronting the Pembertons directly, he made a copy of the journal and sent it with a trusted friend traveling to Hartford, addressed to the colonial authorities there. His caution proved wise. 2 weeks later, Thomas Wilson fell suddenly ill after dining at the Pembertons' home, where he had been invited to discuss legal matters. He died within days, experiencing what witnesses described as terrible visions and ravings that Jeremiah solemnly interpreted as evidence of a guilty conscience being judged by God. In Hartford, Constance's journal prompted an investigation conducted with deliberate discretion. Officials were wary of making accusations against men of the Pembertons, standing without incontrovertible evidence, particularly given the religious nature of the community and the brothers' reputation for piety. Slowly, the investigation proceeded, gathering testimonies from former residents of Newfield who had relocated to other settlements and comparing the unusual pattern of inheritance that had benefited the Pembertons over nearly 2 decades. Numerous obstacles were faced by the colonial officials assigned to the case. Many potential witnesses feared spiritual retribution for speaking against men of God. Others worried about legal consequences if their allegations proved false. The brothers' careful cultivation of community support meant that for every person willing to express suspicion, there were 3 ready to defend their character and piety. Adding to the complexity was the nature of the evidence itself. Constance's journal, while compelling, was the testimony of a young woman, a demographic whose accounts were often dismissed as hysteria or female fancy in colonial society. The pattern of inheritance, while suspicious to modern eyes, could be explained away as the natural result of the brothers' spiritual guidance. And the central allegation that the Pembertons were drugging the dying to manipulate their wills touched on medical and spiritual matters that few colonial officials felt qualified to evaluate. Determined to build an irrefutable case, the Hartford authorities dispatched an undercover agent to Newfield in early 1667. Presenting himself as a wealthy merchant, suffering from a mysterious wasting illness, Thomas Bradford took lodging in Newfield and, predictably, came under the care of Dr. Obadiah Pemberton. Bradford's reports, sent secretly to Hartford, confirmed Constance's allegations, detailing how Obadiah administered strange, tasting medicines that induced confused states, during which Jeremiah would guide conversations towards spiritual matters and property disposition, while Cornelius prepared documents for signature. By early 1667, colonial officials had compiled enough evidence to warrant action. A delegation was dispatched to Newfield with orders to arrest the Pemberton brothers and search their property. But upon arriving, they found the settlement in turmoil. A mysterious fire had destroyed the Pemberton home the previous night, reportedly claiming the lives of all three brothers as they slept. The timing was suspicious, but with the primary suspects deceased and much of the physical evidence destroyed, the official investigation stalled. The story might have ended there, consigned to colonial records and eventually forgotten, had it not been for what was discovered in the spring of 1668. As the new owner of the Pemberton property began clearing the burned ruins to rebuild, workers uncovered a hidden cellar room that had survived the fire. Inside were hundreds of vials containing dried residues of various compounds, journals dating back to 1647 detailing the brothers' methods and victims, and a collection of personal effects belonging to Constance Pemberton, including strands of her hair and fingernail clippings, apparently collected for use in administering their poisons undetected. Most damning was a final journal entry, in Cornelius's hand, dated the day before the fire. The girl's journal has been found. Wilson has betrayed us. Hartford will send men. All must be cleansed by fire, and we must begin anew elsewhere. Providence has delivered us this far, and will not abandon us now. Shock waves through the community were sent by the discovery, prompting a colony-wide search for the brothers, now suspected of having staged their own deaths. Records from that period show increased vigilance at ports and along colonial roads, with descriptions of the Pembertons circulated throughout New England. But despite these efforts, no confirmed sighting of the brothers was ever recorded. One of colonial America's unsolved mysteries remains the true fate of the Pemberton brothers. Some historical accounts suggest they may have fled to the southern colonies, or even returned to England under assumed identities. Others propose more mundane explanations, that they did indeed perish in the fire, perhaps by accident while attempting to destroy evidence, or that they were secretly captured and executed without public record to avoid a scandal that might undermine religious authority in the colonies. An intriguing possibility is provided by colonial records from Virginia. In 1670, three brothers named Preston established themselves in Jamestown, opening an apothecary, a legal practice, and a small chapel, respectively. Descriptions of these men match the approximate ages and appearances of the Pembertons. More tellingly, their arrival coincided with a series of deaths among wealthy colonists who reportedly experienced divine visions before signing new wills. When authorities began investigating these deaths in 1673, the Prestons disappeared overnight, leaving behind a hidden room containing equipment strikingly similar to that described in the Newfield investigation. Similarly, parish records from Bristol, England, document the arrival of 3 brothers named Penworth in 1675, men of middle age who claimed to be returning from the colonies with substantial wealth. These men established themselves quickly in Bristol society, with one becoming a respected physician, another joining the clergy, and the third practicing law. The Penworths were known for their charitable work with the dying, particularly those of means without direct heirs. Their activities ceased abruptly in 1683 when a fire destroyed their shared home, another convenient conflagration that left no bodies to identify. Whether these were the same men operating under different names remains speculative, though the pattern of behavior, the complementary skills, and the convenient disappearances suggest a tantalizing possibility that the Pembertons continued their scheme for decades after fleeing Newfield, adapting and evolving their methods across different jurisdictions. What is certain is the impact of their scheme on the development of legal practices in Connecticut colony. In 1670, the colonial legislature passed what became known as the Witness Statute, requiring multiple, unrelated witnesses for any deathbed will changes and prohibiting those who stood to benefit from serving as witnesses. The statute specifically referenced prevention of fraud through false claims of divine revelation, a clear response to the Pembertons' methods. Over subsequent generations, the Pemberton case faded from public memory, preserved mainly in legal records and occasional references in private correspondence. By the mid-18th century, it had become little more than a cautionary tale told to law students and medical apprentices about the potential for abuse when spiritual authority, medical knowledge, and legal power were combined without proper oversight. If you're finding this historical account as disturbing as I do, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more forgotten tales from America's dark past. I'd be interested to know in the comments if you've ever heard of similar historical cases of exploitation under the guise of religious authority. Now, let's continue with what historians have uncovered about the aftermath of the Pemberton scandal. The story might have remained buried in colonial archives had it not been for Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, a Yale historian specializing in early American medical practices. In 1998, while researching the development of palliative care in colonial New England, Dr. Hawthorne discovered references to the Pemberton case in the personal papers of Jonathan Edwards, the famous 18th-century theologian who had apparently used the case as evidence in his private writings about the dangers of false spiritual claims. Intrigued, Dr. Hawthorne began a systematic search through Connecticut's colonial records, eventually uncovering the original investigation documents in a misfiled archive box at the Connecticut Historical Society. The materials included copies of the Pemberton's journals, witness testimonies, and, most valuably, Constance Pemberton's personal journal, which had been preserved as evidence. What makes the Pemberton case particularly significant to historians is not just the brothers' scheme itself, but what it reveals about the intersection of medicine, religion, and law in colonial America. The brothers exploited a society where these 3 domains were still tightly interwoven, using each to reinforce their authority in the others. Their medical knowledge gave them access to the dying, their religious standing protected them from suspicion, and their legal authority allowed them to formalize their fraudulent acquisitions. Modern analysis of the journal descriptions suggests that the Pembertons' elixir of divine sight was likely a sophisticated combination of opium, belladonna, and possibly other psychoactive plants native to New England. The dosages were carefully calculated based on the victim's weight and constitution, designed to induce a specific state of delirium, coherent enough to speak, but disconnected enough from reality to be highly suggestible. Dr. Melissa Thornton, a medical historian at Johns Hopkins University who analyzed the formula descriptions in 2002, noted, "The combination shows a surprisingly advanced understanding of neurochemistry for the 17th century. What makes the Pemberton's concoction particularly sophisticated wasn't just the ingredients, but the precise ratios and administration methods. They had developed what amounts to an early truth serum, combined with a hallucinogen, calibrated to produce a very specific cognitive state in which subjects remained verbally responsive but highly suggestible with diminished critical thinking. The formula appears to have been refined through careful observation and experimentation." Dr. Thornton wrote, "Early journal entries show numerous adjustments to the mixture, with notations about the effects of various ratios on different subjects. Increased tincture of belladonna by 5 drops for the Henderson widow resulted in more vivid visions. But excessive physical agitation. Return to previous formulation, but extend preparation period by 2 days for similar subjects," reads one entry from 1651. Particularly disturbing is evidence that the brothers conducted deliberate experiments on unwitting subjects. Several journal entries describe administering different variations of their elixir to traveling strangers who sought shelter with them for a night, noting the effects and refining their formula based on the results. These unfortunate travelers, whose names were never recorded, appear to have been selected specifically because their temporary presence in the community meant their odd behavior would not attract sustained attention, and their subsequent departure or disappearance would raise no alarms. A chilling level of calculation in the brothers' methods is revealed by the journals. They would study each victim's speech patterns, religious beliefs, and property holdings before administering their elixir. During the induced delirium, they would ask leading questions incorporating these details, making the resulting divine instructions seem authentically personal. They would introduce specific religious imagery known to resonate with the individual, creating an experience that witnesses would find convincingly spiritual. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that the Pemberton scheme was not their first. References in their earliest journals suggest they had attempted similar methods in Massachusetts Bay Colony, but had been forced to relocate after raising suspicions. This pattern of calculated movement and adaptation indicates a level of premeditation that transcends opportunism, suggesting instead a carefully designed criminal enterprise disguised as religious service. The case of the Pemberton brothers serves as a dark reminder of how authority, particularly when wrapped in the mantle of religion, can be manipulated for personal gain. In a society where questioning religious experience was itself considered potentially sinful, the brothers created a nearly perfect system of exploitation, targeting the most vulnerable members of society at their most vulnerable moments. The historical record goes silent on the Pembertons after 1668, but local legends in various New England communities suggest the brothers may have continued their practices under different identities. A similar case was recorded in Rhode Island in 1682, involving 3 brothers named Preston, who attended to the dying with remarkably similar methods. By 1690, reports emerged from Philadelphia of spiritual physicians who helped the wealthy achieve divine visions in their final hours, often resulting in unexpected changes to their wills. Whether these were the Pembertons operating under new identities or merely copycat schemes inspired by rumors of their success remains unknown. What is clear is that their methods created a template that others could follow, exploiting the same vulnerabilities in colonial society. The most poignant aspect of the Pemberton case remains the fate of Constance. Historical records confirm that she did indeed stand to inherit a substantial estate from her maternal grandmother upon reaching 18. Property in England worth far more than all the Pembertons had accumulated through their years of fraud. The brothers' plan, detailed in their private journals, was to begin administering small, undetectable doses of their compounds to Constance months before her 18th birthday, gradually increasing the amount until she experienced a spiritual revelation, directing her to sign over her inheritance to them, followed by a fatal overdose that would appear as natural illness. Constance's discovery of their scheme and her attempted escape represents one of history's might-have-beens. Had she reached Hartford with her evidence, the Pembertons might have been stopped years earlier, saving numerous victims from their predation. Instead, her death became yet another in the brothers' long list of crimes, distinguished only by the fact that it ultimately led to their exposure. In the centuries since, the Pemberton case has been referenced in legal scholarship as one of the earliest documented instances of systematic inheritance fraud in American history. It has been studied by medical historians for its early example of pharmaceutical manipulation for criminal purposes. And for religious scholars, it stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unquestioning faith in spiritual authority. The site where the Pemberton home once stood remains undeveloped to this day, part of a protected historical area in what is now the town of Newfield, Connecticut. Local residents still speak of strange dreams afflicting those who spend too long near the foundation stones that are all that remain of the original structure. Whether these stories represent the psychological impact of knowing the site's history or something more mysterious remains, like much about the Pemberton case, a matter of personal interpretation. What we do know with certainty is that between 1647 and 1667, three brothers systematically exploited the faith, fear, and vulnerability of a colonial community, amassing wealth and power through a carefully orchestrated fraud that claimed dozens of victims. Their methods combined scientific knowledge, religious manipulation, and legal maneuvering in ways that were centuries ahead of their time in terms of criminal sophistication. As you listen to this account, you might wonder how such a scheme could succeed for so long without detection. The answer lies in the perfect storm of conditions the Pembertons exploited: a society where questioning religious experience was itself suspicious, where medical knowledge was limited and largely unregulated, where legal documentation was rudimentary and concentrated in few hands, and where community trust was essential for survival, making people reluctant to voice suspicions about respected figures. In many ways, the story of the Pemberton brothers serves as a mirror reflecting our own vulnerabilities to those who would exploit our